All right, so we've got the link wired up. We're gonna test the trigger signal. I'm gonna tap it with a wrench, and as you can see, it goes yes. So we've got trigger signal now with the link. Okay, so we have the fuel pump disabled for the moment. We've got the sensor back in place. Perfect. So I wanted to give everyone a reminder on why this is difficult and why we had to switch ECUs. So it's not an issue with the ECU Masters EMU. It's still by far my favorite ECU. It's just the way that the E07Z motor is set up. So on virtually every engine that I've ever encountered, there is a crank trigger, whether it's built into the distributor, if it's on the crank itself, whatever. But there's a primary trigger signal. On this motor, there's only a cam sensor. So the way the trigger pattern is set up is just really awkward, and the ECU Masters is just not ready for it. Now, the Link ECU, on the other hand, actually has a specific trigger for specific setting for this motor. So that's why we had to switch. Okay, so we're gonna run the injector test, and I'm gonna just cycle all three of them. That's cylinder 1, cylinder 2, cylinder number 3. So we've got injectors working. Now we're gonna test the coils. Okay, now we're gonna test the coils. And it doesn't seem like we have anything on coil side. Oh. So that's coil 3. It should have been coil 1 though. So we know 1 and 3 need to get swapped. I'm going to move over to 2. Let's see if we get 2 running. 2 works. And then finally, I'm going to move over here to number 3. Hopefully 3 works when I set up 1. And if it does, that means that I've just got to swap those 2 wires around. All right, so that means that we've got 1 and 3 swapped. Not a huge deal. So we'll fix that really quick and we'll move forward. So we couldn't get the car started. We were getting spark, but not injector pulse width. So I would spray carb cleaner in it and it would fire up. So I went through a bunch of settings and couldn't figure it out. So I posted up on one of the help groups, and someone mentioned that because the map sensor is not configured, it wouldn't start, which I thought was really weird. The fact that we would get spark but no injector pulse because of the map sensor. So I set it up to use the internal map sensor, which it wasn't by default for some reason in the software. So I set that up and we got injector pulse, and check this out. So we're getting trigger errors though, but that could be from that sensor just not being all the way in, but it starts and runs. All right, so it's running. We didn't have alternator, so I just jimmied up an alternator. I stole the plug off of the Integra I was working on, off of one of his spare harnesses. So now we've got battery charging, everything's working. Sounds like complete dog shit, but it runs. It's idling pretty decent. It's got a ton of vacuum leaks. But it sounds good. Oof. We got vacuum leaks all over the place on this guy. So it looks like some on the charge piping. We've got a vacuum line back there that's smoking, not a big deal. Let's see if there's any more on the other side. So here's that vacuum line that's got a screw in it, not a big deal. We've got something else that's leaking down here that's not on the charge pipe. I'm not exactly sure what's leaking down there. So, okay, we know what we've got to fix tomorrow. Okay, so as a continuation as of yesterday, we've got the car running kind of decent. It's got a ton of vacuum leaks. There's a few more things I've got to wire up. So I've got our auxiliary sensors hooked up. So I have intake air temp and coolant temp. So here is the coolant temp down here and the intake air temp up here. So looking at the connectors, one looks like a J series, like a Honda V6 connector, like a Odyssey, Pilot, stuff like that. And then this other one looks like a AP2, so 06, I think it's 06 to whatever S2000 is what this looks like, but I can't be for sure. I've looked at I set them up as like Honda sensors, and it seems to be pretty accurate, so we're gonna leave that alone. Alternator needs to officially be wired up. This is an OBD2 style alternator. Obviously we're reusing the Beat factory charge harness stuff, so I've got to either get an adapter or just hardwire it in. I need to sync timing as well, and that's what we're going to do next. So we've got a ton of vacuum leaks, as I tested yesterday, like a ton of them, but right now that's not super important. We got to get the timing synced, and then we'll have to figure out what to do about a wideband. The moment you guys have all been waiting for. So it's got a high idle. Like I said, we've got a ton of vacuum leaks, but there it is, started making noises. So the smoke test failed, as you saw earlier. So it's either going to be the intake manifold or the injector O-ring. Now, when I spoke to the inker, he said that he removed the injectors, but not the intake manifold. So since they're so in close proximity of one another, I'm just going to replace it with O-rings. These O-rings look like they're about the same size. These are just standard EV14 style O-rings that look pretty close. So we'll fit these on and hopefully it seals our leak. Or it gets worse and then we know at least it is the injectors. Alright, so before I couldn't cap it off, and if I capped off the throttle body, it would still stay running. So now when I cap it off with my hand, you see it died. So that was our vacuum leak there. The next problem is that our idle valve is stuck. So if I cap it off with my finger, you can see that the idle is relatively normal. So as you can see, I can basically close the throttle and it will completely stall. So that tells me that there's an issue with the idle control valve. The thing with the idle control valve, unlike other Hondas, this idle control valve is actually a stepper motor. So it's a 4-wire idle valve. And in order to run a 4-wire idle valve, like an H-bridge motor, you have to have 4 dedicated outputs. The problem with the Monsoon is that it does have 6 aux outputs, but they're not high current outputs, so we're not able to control it with that. So at this point, I don't really know what we're going to do in terms of idle. So I can basically remove the idle switch or idle valve altogether, and maybe we can cap it off and then crack the throttle. It's not ideal, but that probably would be the best route to go. So the stepper motors are moved, and if you can see, it's hard to tell, but there's a opening there that's like rectangular, not the hole, but that little rectangular looking piece. That's what we actually have to block off to get idle under control. So here's the idle valve itself removed. There's not an easy way of like moving these. If you guys know an easy way of doing it, let me know. But essentially what's happening is that hole is like vacuum from the intake manifold. It's bypassing the throttle body. And this little seal right here should keep it completely shut, but it's not doing that. And so here's the idle air control valve. And so when this piece is pushed in, there should be a little bit of, this area should be slightly open. And the way this works is this plunger moves in and out to seal the hole that is on that hole right there. So basically this piston moves in and out to allow a controlled vacuum leak. But since we cannot control this with our current ECU, the only thing that we can do is just crack the throttle and try to find a different way to actuate our idle. So this is the stepper motor that we can't control. I can't find a way to actually control this, so I'm going to just try to break it apart, really. and what we're going to try to do is see if we can somehow make the shaft, put a nut on the end or something, so that way we can manually screw it in and out. So hopefully this goes well, but what we're going to do is break the plastic off of it first. So as usual, I was overthinking things as always. So initially I tried to just rotate the plastic cap off, but then I realized that this is just a motor. So then I put this piece in a vise and I spun it, and guess what, it unscrewed. So we're gonna throw this back in and test it. So it's barely idling now, but at least it's not revving to 3,000 RPMs. So I'm gonna play around with that idle valve just a hair more to get a little bit of idle out of it. So messing with the idle valve, like manually screwing it in, it's got like a somewhat decent idle right now. It's not gonna be perfect by any means. And so generally speaking, what happens, believe it or not, is actually inverse. So when you have a working idle valve, you don't want the idle valve doing all the work. So you'll end up actually cracking the throttle blade just a hair, you know, just to get like a decent idle when cold, meaning that the car should start without the idle valve. It may not idle very well, but it should start, and then the idle valve should take over its work. And so what we're going to do is actually the inverse, is like we're going to adjust the idle. Right now the throttle is completely closed on this car. So what we're going to do is we're going to crack the idle valve, probably leave it where it's at actually, just so that it has a decent idle when cold. And then from there you'll just have to actually modulate the throttle or adjust the throttle depending to your liking. So we're definitely making some progress there. So before we tighten it all the way up, we're going to go ahead and put on the charge piping. We're going to put on the charge piping, and then we're going to check the idle again. We'll let it sit for a little bit longer as I'm putting the charge pipe back on. That way hopefully it has enough time to cool down, and then we'll set it again and make sure it's good, and then we'll move forward. Alrighty, since Inker's such a piece of shit, he didn't wire up the fan, but that's okay. Your boy Steve's here. So the fan wiring on most Hondas, early 90s Hondas, has like its own separate fan switch. So there was a sensor that went into the bottom of the radiator, and yeah, it would kick on the fan. So what we're going to do is we're going to retain the factory harness and the factory relay, and I basically just depinned it and went from color to color. And so in these two wires, one is black for ground and the other is blue. The only wire that we're concerned of is the blue wire, and the blue wire is going to be our trigger wire. So what happens is that when the switch from the factory gets to a certain temp, it should ground out, and then the fan should start to run. So with the pin tool stuck into there, when I ground it, the fan runs. Obviously it's going to be kind of weird because the connection is not perfect, but the fan runs. So what we're going to do is we're just going to run a wire from the link to here, and then it'll kick over the fan for us. Alrighty, so we got the fan wired up, tested and working. I don't think this temp calibration is correct though, so we're going to have to dive into more than that. Car's been running for a hot minute, just doesn't seem right. We got wideband working, and we have it set up on CAN as well. So I'm not going to go into the CAN setup because I've done that before on like the Integra or whatever. But so we're making a bit more progress. Like I said, I just don't think this calibration is correct. There's just no way that it's just really that low after it's been running for a while. So I'm gonna let it continue to run and see what happens. This thing is so silly. Look how fast it builds boost just from revving. If you saw it hit 150 kPa, which is like 7 pounds of boost from just free revving, that's so stupid.